July 1518. A woman stepped into the streets of Strasbourg and began to dance. But she didn't stop. For 6 days straight, she danced until her feet bled, collapsing from exhaustion, only to rise and dance again. Within weeks, 400 people joined her in this fevered, unstoppable movement. Some danced themselves to death, and it is said up to 15 people were dying every single day. There was no music, there was no explanation, just wild and uncontrollable dancing. No, this isn't a curse from some fantasy novel, this actually happened, and what makes it truly terrifying is we still don't understand why. It is 1518 AD, Strasbourg, and it's a city on the edge of collapse. Imagine streets filled with the starving and the sick. Famine has ravaged the region for years. Syphilis and plague are tearing through the population, and the peasants' revolt has left the social fabric in tatters. People were desperate, terrified, and clinging to survival in a world that frankly seemed set out to destroy them. And then things take a turn for the strange. On a nice, warm, beautiful July morning, a woman named Fra Truffaut stepped into the street and started dancing. But this wasn't any normal dancing, it wasn't celebration. Witnesses describe her movements as spasmodic, convulsive, that her arms thrashed widely, her eyes were vacant, unfocused, and she was dancing with the intensity of someone possessed. And by that, her body was moving in ways that seemed beyond her control. City physicians documented everything. They say she danced for 60 days without stopping, without food, and whatever water they can get down her, which was barely any. And she would collapse from exhaustion, her feet bleeding, and then impossibly, she would rise and continue. And then it gets terrifying. Others joined her. Within a week, around 30 people were dancing, and by August, that number had swelled to approximately 400. The streets of Strasbourg transformed into a nightmare. Day and night, in public markets and alleys and streets, people danced. Matter of fact, we even have a contemporary poem that describes it as such. Women and men who dance and hop in the public market, in alleys and streets, day and night, until the sickness stopped. The physicians on hand observed blood-soaked feet, the bodies drenched in sweat, and ultimately, people crying out in pain, begging for mercy for it to stop, when their bodies refused to. Some dancers were thrashing so hard and so violently that it appeared as seizures. All of it was involuntary. Now, chronicles from time claim that up to 15 people were dying every day from heart attacks, strokes, sheer exhaustion, and the exact death toll remains unknown. However, all of this puts together that there is one undeniable fact. The dancing happened, and that people were literally dancing themselves to death. And this is where the government comes in. The powers that be that always make it better, right? No. You see, the authorities made everything worse. The city council consulted with the physicians, who at the time believed in the medieval theory of hot blood. That is, that the afflicted had overheated blood and the only cure was more dancing. Let them dance it out of the systems, they said. So the authorities hired musicians, built stages, and encouraged more dancing. And, as you might guess, the contagion spread like wildfire. So now we have hundreds of people dancing to the sounds of pipes and drums under the scorching summer sun, unable to stop, collapsing and dying on the streets, and those who were still afflicted, forced to just dance over the bodies. It's like something out of a horror story. And it's real. The Dancing Plague continued starting in early July and ending in August. You see, as mysteriously as it began, it subsided in early September. Just like that, it stopped. The dancers were carted to the shrine of St. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, where they were given red shoes and small crosses. Prayer rituals were performed, and just like that, boom, it all ended. So why did it happen in the first place? This is a question modern historians have spent decades trying to answer, and the theories range from the scientific to the supernatural. Now, at first, we have the mass hysteria theory, which is the most widely accepted explanation. Historian John Waller argues in his book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, that the Dancing Plague was a stress-induced psychic epidemic. Strasbourg's residents were living under extreme duress. Famine, disease, death all around them, fears of apocalyptic nightmares. And in this context, it's really easy to see how some people might enter a trance-like state as a cultural response to this unbearable despair. Matter of fact, mass psychogenic illnesses really aren't unheard of, and we have some similar outbreaks through history. In Tanzania, we had the laughing epidemics. We had the medieval flagellant movements, and in modern times, we have multiple cases of mass fainting and twitching in schools. The idea basically is this. When communities experience collective trauma, sometimes the mind breaks in collective in unusual ways. I do find this a little bit of a condescending theory personally. These are my 2 cents. But it's just, as I've gone into these mysteries, a lot of things that involve mass amounts of people that historians or scientists can't explain, this is a label that just gets put on it. As case open, case closed. It kind of feels like something of like, we don't know, so this is what we're going to say. So we have a neat box to put it into. But there are just so many cases where you have doctor notes and going along with what witnesses are saying that it doesn't fit. Matter of fact, if you want to look into that, you could look at some of the Marian apparitions down in South America. Now we move on to the Ergot poisoning theory. This is one of my favorite, and in fact something I would like to write into one of my fantasy books. And this was really a popular theory in the 20th century. And you see, ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. And when it's consumed, it causes hallucinations, convulsions, and a condition called St. Anthony's fire. Which makes me wonder, could contaminated bread have caused the dancing plague? The problem is ergot poisoning affects individuals randomly, not contagiously. It wouldn't really explain how and why the dancing seemed to spread from person to person in a synchronized way. It also typically causes people to curl up like a spider because they're in so much pain, not become loosey-goosey open and dance for days on end. So, in general, this is a dismissed theory. Now we have the religious and the supernatural explanations. And this definitely aligns with what people in Strasbourg believed at the time. You see, a lot of the accounts saw the dancing as a divine punishment or demonic possession, further reinforced by the blessings that they received at St. Vitus's. Matter of fact, so much so that some thought it was St. Vitus who cursed them for sins committed. The city was deeply Catholic, and events like this were interpreted often through the lens of spiritual warfare. Now, from a modern perspective, these could seem fantastical, but they, whether true or not, reveal just how terrified people were and how they tried to make sense of this. I will say I do believe in demonic possession and the supernatural, having experiences of my own, and just that there's really good documented cases involving supernatural and demonic possession. And if you want to learn more about that, I highly, highly, highly recommend a very good podcast called The Exorcist Files. Even if you don't believe it, their audio drama level of bringing these cases to life makes for a good story. But don't listen with it, your kids. It's not appropriate for kids. I also find the idea that this might be St. Vitus's curse to be not super aligned with the Catholic teaching. You see saints normally do saintly things. They help heal. They are called for intercession, for bringing people back together, for getting rid of demons. You don't really see a lot of saints bringing curses and plagues. That's generally, especially in the Old Testament, more of the providence of God. So that seems, I don't know about that one. Now we do have the hoax theory, and that suggests that the chronicles were exaggerated or even invented for moral lessons. But there's a problem with that. We have multiple independent sources that confirm it. City council records, church sermons, physician accounts, poems, they all describe the same phenomenon. It's very unlikely that this was fabricated. And what happened in Strasbourg in 1518 was real. 400 people did dance themselves uncontrollably for weeks. Some died, and the authorities made it worse. And it's also not unique. We have other documented cases. So we have a similar outbreak that occurred in Europe between the 10th and the 16th centuries in Aachen in 1374, in other cities through the Holy Roman Empire. However, the 1518 event is the most thoroughly documented and the most studied and the most disturbing. And if we're going to just blow it off as a hoax because it doesn't fit with our modern sensibilities, it doesn't really hold up. And I say that because you have all these different documentation suggesting that this did happen. And that's more documentation than a lot of events that we have down in our history books. So if we're going to blow this off, we're probably blowing off most of what we think we know about history. Now, the Dancing Plague of 1518 is a reminder that history doesn't need magic to be horrifying. Real people in a real city danced themselves to exhaustion and death for reasons that can't be explained. There wasn't a curse that we know of or a spell, but it was human suffering in its most inexplicable form. So if this story fascinated you, hit that like button and subscribe for some more tales. That proves reality is weirder than fantasy. And why don't you share this with someone who loves diving into history's strangest mysteries? And if you also love this sort of stuff and you love fantasy, then I invite you to come explore these themes in my fiction books. Check out my fantasy works at isaacyorks.com or sign up for my mailing list to receive a new short story and bookish updates every month. Because if real history can be this strange, imagine what stories we can tell. All right, thanks for watching. Keep questioning, keep wondering, and remember, the truth is always weirder than fantasy.